What's up guys, this is Greyhat. We're going to be continuing our Hand2note database analysis. We've already looked at pre-flop play for this hero. Now we're going to be running some basic analysis on hero's play as the aggressor. Now the most important aspect of playing as the aggressor is c-betting in position in single raised heads up pots. C-bet flop especially, but also c-bet turn and river to a lesser extent. Let's have a look at hero's values. We see 70% c-bet flop in position, 85% barrel turn, and 40% triple barrel river. What would we expect to see for these values? Flop c-bet usually 65%, so we can see we're a shade high at 70%. Turn we'd expect to see around 52%, so 85% is well up there. Definitely indicative that something is not quite right with hero's turn play. Finally, the river c-bet stat should be around 44%. But it's important to keep in mind that this is hero's river triple barrel value in the context of how he plays the early streets. In other words, this particular hero is getting to the river with a range that's clearly unorthodox, so there's no point trying to compare that river triple barrel stat to what an appropriate value would be. Normally what we do here is we fix the earlier street play, then see what happens to the later street stats, and then work on that part of hero's game. Now we're going to jump straight to c-bet turn in this case, because that is significantly too high. Yes, flop is slightly too high, but we're going to experience bigger problems on the turn here, according to this data. And also, when we do analyze turn play, very often drag some flop situations through also. Now one of the great things about the Death Star 2 HUD is we can simply hover over the appropriate stat, c-bet turn in position. We can now see a breakdown of all of the hands the hero has fired a second barrel with in a single raised heads up pot. So you can see the different categories: trash, gut shot, OESD, etc. Now which types of hands should not barrel the turn? Let's start there, because we would definitely expect there to be some bad double barrels in this strategy given how high the frequency is for the turn barrel. Well, as a very rough guide, we don't expect to see too many trash hands double barreling. One simple rule that you can follow is there's rarely any need to do anything on the turn in terms of bluffing without at least some kind of gut shot. Now there are exceptions to this, but double barreling in position in single raised heads up pots is generally not an exception. So if we don't have at least a gut shot, it's unlikely that it's going to be profitable or the max EV line. Let's take a look at the trash hands that hero has double barreled. Notice once again we can simply hover our cursor over the post flop diagram there. You can see all of the hands that Hand2note has categorized as trash that hero decided to fire a second barrel with. As we do this, we'll probably notice that some of the flop c-bets are slightly too wide as well, because here had 70% c-bet flop rather than 65. Now I'm going to encourage you to try and get used to the algebraic output here. It is possible to see hands in the replayer, but it is much faster if you could just scroll down this list of hands and see what the action was and spot leaks that way. The first hand there, the Queen Jack, that's definitely okay as a continuation bet because it's an ISO raised pot in position. And generally, limp callers fold way too much, facing continuation bets around 50% at the time, so that's fine. Should we barrel a turned ace? My recommendation is it's not worth it. Now, texturally, an ace is an okay card to barrel, but it doesn't guarantee that the EV of firing a second barrel is better than the EV of checking back the turn and going for some type of stop and go bluff. So let's stick to our simple rule. If we don't have at least a gut shot or some kind of pair that needs protecting, then we shouldn't be double barreling. So we're going to chalk that first Queen Jack up as a mistake, and here we should have employed a bet check bet line instead. Ace Jack, now this hand has some potential, but if we look at the texture, it is not the best for our hand. Once again, this is another ISO raised pot, so we're going to go ahead and fire a continuation bet. Should we barrel the turn? Well, we didn't pick up equity. We don't want to be barreling here. In fact, this hand can probably just check back the turn, and then probably check again on the river, hoping to win at showdown with Ace Jack high. Ace King, this is a standard open raised pot. If our continuation bet on the Jack 6-5, we'll just about get away with that. We have two overcards. We probably have the best hand with Ace King high, and we have the backdoor Broadway straight draw. Did we pick up equity on the turn? We didn't. So should we fire? No, we should check back the turn here. King 6 is obviously a little bit of a weird hand based on the ISO raise sizing there. So villain limps, and hero makes it 2.8, so already a bit strange. It is okay to c-bet very aggressively against limp callers, but once again, we barrel the turn without equity. King 10, another ISO raise pot, let's skip past that. Ace 8, So here we see a good continuation bet on the flop. So we open raise, flop a good 2-card backdoor nut flush draw. Definitely a slam dunk c-bet on the jack high semi-dry texture. Should we barrel the turn? We didn't pick up equity, so this is a mistake. A7. It's fine to c-bet aggressively on monotone textures. It generally auto profit against most player pools. But when we brick the turn, we shouldn't be firing. So we can see that kind of thing going on here. Here it is just barreling too wide with trash. Now the idea is we could spend probably a few hours just going through each of the categories and pinpointing all of the mistakes. We don't have time for that right now, so let's just pick one more category. Let's see if we can find a situation where Hero has a vulnerable pair. He should have checked back the turn with the intention of bluff catching against a river pro bet, but he decides to double barrel. Now if such mistakes exist, where would we find them? Certainly pair plus draw is a logical candidate. So for example, when we have something like the Queen 6 flush draw for our continuation bet on the flop, when we pick up a pair, it's often the best play to check back, then bluff catch against a river pro bet. Another example, the Jack 10. Now you could even argue a check back on the flop. You see this is a good board texture for the cold caller. We don't want to play especially aggressively here. Plus, we have the backdoor straights covered with this kind of hand, which generally means that it's going to be a lot easier to do things like call against turn pro bets, because very often we'll have a pair plus a draw. So this is an opportunity to actually just check back the flop. Here if I was continuation bet, that's reasonable. Now the turn is good in the sense that we pick up an OESD, but bad in the sense that it coordinates quite heavily with the flop check caller's range. So this is a great spot to check back. We can pretty much peel against the river pro bet on the vast majority of river cards, maybe all of them. And finally, it allows us to fully realize our equity. There's always the chance that if we fire the second barrel, we might get check raised. And sometimes we can continue, sometimes we can't. It depends on the price we're getting. We have some issues with continuing. We do in fact get check raised here, which is not going to happen a lot. So this is not an I told you so moment or anything like that. Here is still unlucky to get check raised. But this does factor into our thought process. We don't really want to get blown off our equity here. The problem with facing the raise is that many of our outs are dominated. So we only have a 1-card OESD, which means we don't have the nuts on a queen. We don't even have the nuts on a 7, because we could still lose to queen jack right now. Then the other problem is, even if we make our straight, sometimes it's going to be the heart on the river or the diamond on the river that completes our straight. So we're still dominated. So whatever happens here, we're really struggling in terms of reverse implied odds. So this is very likely a bad call on the turn without going too deeply into the maths. Other examples can be found in situations where we don't have a redraw, but we still have a fairly robust second pair type hand, sometimes even top pair type hand, where the best play is to check back the turn and then bluff catch against the river pro bet. You can find some of those in the mid pair category potentially. Let's see if we can find one example. In fact, the top example here, we have the King 10 of diamonds for our continuation bet in position on the King 8-3. That's fine. The turn is an ace, and there's really no reason to fire a second barrel there. If we assume we have the best hand on the turn, it's really unlikely we're going to be outdrawn by the river. So you should feel very comfortable just checking back the turn here, then bluff catching against a river pro bet. Moving on, let's have a look at the out of position play for Hero. So we have c-bet flop, turn and river out of position, single raise heads up pots. Hero's values are 55 flop, 61 double barrel turn, and 49 triple barrel river. What would we expect to see for flop c-bet out of position? Now this stat does have a range of acceptable values, and honestly, there are winning players that have this stat anywhere from 0 to about 50. It's rare that a good player in the modern environment will have a c-bet out of position of above 50%. There are many players who are just checking their entire range out of position as the PFR, a single raised heads up pot. This is not the best approach for reasons that we won't go into right now, but it's definitely better than c-betting too aggressively out of position in single raised heads up pots. I would imagine a very good winning reg's probably going to have something around 30 to 40% c-bet flop out of position. So we can see this player is technically c-betting too much out of position. Turn barrel would expect it to be similar to in position, around 50 to 52% barrel turn. Remember, we always have to take these stats into context of the early street stats. So this is a player who is only barreling the turn perhaps slightly too much on face value. 61% instead of 52%. But we also have to remember that this player is getting to the turn too wide to begin with because he's c-betting the flop 55 instead of something like 35%. So although these leaks don't seem to be as extreme out of position, here is definitely c-betting and barreling too aggressively. In terms of river triple barrel OOP, we'd expect that river stat to probably be more like 35 to 40%, not 49%. Now, what kind of issues can cause an overly high river triple barrel stat? There's generally two things. Number one, bluffing too aggressively. In fact, triple barrel bluffing out of position is not a good idea in the majority of player pools. Opponents fold a lot less to river bets when they're in position, as opposed to out of position where they fold slightly more. The other cause of an overly high river triple barrel stat is when players are trying to value bet too thin. Maybe they'll have something like top pair weak kicker, and they'll try and extract 3 full-size streets of value. And although they'll sometimes get called by worse hands on the river, a basic objective, or a simplified viewpoint of a value bet, is it needs to be good over 50% of the time when called. And although something like a top pair weak kicker might be good some of the time, might even be good 40% of the time, it's not going to be a max EV line, it's not going to be a plus EV value bet, because in order for that to be true, we have to be good over 50% of the time when our opponent continues against that bet. Once again, we can pull up some very basic examples. If we have a look at flop c-bet OOP, probably wouldn't be too difficult to find a spot where we c-bet too aggressively. One thing that can be a useful analysis vector is to have a look at the different board textures and how we're playing on them. One of the board textures we want to play the least aggressively on is mid-range connected textures. Sometimes refer to these as code red board textures. Let's have a look at hands that Hero has filed a continuation bet with on code red textures. Especially if we look at the trash category, we're almost guaranteed to find some overly wide c-bets here. So if we just look at that first example, we open raise out of position, presumably small blind versus big blind. Big blind calls at 2.4x open. The board texture is Jack 7-9. This is a very good board texture for the cold caller. Very bad board texture for us as the open raiser. The logical strategy here is simply not to c-bet very aggressively. Now we will have some c-betting range. Example of a hand that wants to c-bet here, something like ace-jack or ace-9 for example. But a huge percentage of the hands that we have are going to opt for a check, either with the intention of check calling, check raising, or in some cases, as in the example hand that we have here, ace-4, we're just going to be check folding. This is just not the right texture we're looking for. So although we did c-bet and we did manage to take down the pot, this was an overly wide c-bet. It's not going to be profitable in the long run. If you have a look at the ace-king, this was possibly MP versus cutoff. So we're still out of position. We have ace-king. This time we have a backdoor 1-card second nut flush draw with that king of diamonds. But the problem here again is the texture. 9-8-6. Very coordinated. Code red texture. Definitely should just be check folding in this spot rather than throwing continuation bet. In some cases, hands might just about be strong enough to check call. This hand is at least somewhat close, given that we have ace-king high and we have the backdoor diamonds, but depending on the size, it's actually okay just to go ahead and check fold. Once again, this is not the kind of texture we're looking for. We're going to have plenty of other hands in our range that have some kind of pair, that have some kind of gut shot, that have better backdoor equity. So really no need to continue with ace-king. 5-4 on the king, queen, 9. That's a slightly better texture for us just because it has high cards out there, which is usually good for the PFR. We have 0 equity, we should be check folding. So we're seeing lots of examples of bad continuation bets out of position on the flop. Just to cite some other important situations as the aggressor. Delayed c-bets we're interested in. You can see here it has a delayed c-bet of 98% here, which is very, very high. What this means is that there are probably some opportunities for Hero to fine-tune this aspect of his game. So aggression is definitely good in this part of the game. It's definitely much better to be overly aggressive than overly passive. But we're usually looking for a slightly more well-rounded 75 or 80%. So we do want to play very aggressively here, exploitatively at least. GTO-wise, we don't quite delayed c-bet that aggressively. But exploitatively, we're looking for like 75, maybe even 80%. But not 98%. There are probably some hands in there which are not max EV delayed c-bets and should have been checked instead. Alright, thanks for watching guys. Fire up your database, have a look at the values we've looked at in the session, and see if you can make some tweaks to your play as the aggressor.